Boardroom Bound, Episode 22. 3 Qualities Required to be an Effective Board Member with Barry Rowan.
What makes us attractive as prospective board members are experiences that demonstrate our competencies and our ability to do things well.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's episode, we'll be speaking with Barry Rowan. Barry had a lifetime of board experience, literally a lifetime. Since age 26, he has been in a board environment every quarter. It's amazing to think about someone who's been in the nonprofit and the for-profit realm, paid board roles, volunteer roles, all sorts of capacities, and the information that he will give. And he will be sharing with us multiple ways that we can take this forward. For example, the 3 C's framework for how board director interviews happen. They'll be looking for competency, they'll be looking for chemistry, and they'll be looking for character. Barry's got lots of great ideas that he's going to share with us today. Let's jump into the show. Barry Rowan, delighted to have you on Boardroom Bound today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Alexander. Great to be here.
Well, we were talking just before we went on air, and I love this nugget of your history. I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like it before. You were explaining that you've been in a board meeting every quarter since you were 26 years old.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's right. And I am no longer 26 years old. For our listeners who can't see me, I'm slightly older than that. I'm actually 62 now, but it's just been by virtue of the kind of jobs that I've held. I've had executive positions since that period of time. And with that comes the opportunity and the responsibility to sit in the board meetings for the companies I've been part of running. So I've done that since that period of time.
So that's a tremendous amount of experience for us to unpack today. So you have been in the board roles as an executive and also a non-executive. We've got the nonprofit, the for-profit, the paid board, the volunteers. So much to share with our listeners today. Do you feel like there are some commonalities between all of those differences that stand out to you?
Yeah, there are certainly commonalities about being a board member. One of them, I think, is the fact that as board members, we're responsible for the stewardship of the firm or the organization that we're a part of, and that's certainly very important to me. By way of background, I went through a big struggle early in my career over meaning in work, and what is the role of business in society, and why am I working so hard, and by what measure will I judge success in my life? And out of that came a transformed view of business, which is the career that I have pursued for these 30 plus years, and really came to realize that the fundamental purpose is to serve and to contribute to a better society, and it does that through things like responsible value creation and serving customers and creating an environment for employees, being a good corporate citizen. So when viewed through that lens, I think the role of being a board member is a natural extension of that, because we are kind of keepers of the flame. We're responsible to oversee the business or the organization, whether it's a nonprofit organization or business, and to ensure that it is being well run and that it is living up to its promise and potential to make the contribution that it was designed to do.
So in some ways that it sounds easy, but it's really hard, right? As a board member, well, let's think about it. We're transitioning from executive to non-executive in this discussion. When you're an executive in the board, you're having those discussions, you're having that guidance, you then go away and do something actionable to implement that feedback. On the non-executive side, you're having strategy discussions, you're trying to hold the group accountable for what you want them to achieve. There's a different tension there, right?
Yes, they're very different responsibilities and roles, and I think it's important for the board member in this case to be aware of that. As an executive and being on the leadership teams of organizations I've been a part of, our natural tendency is to figure out what to do and to go make things happen. And I have a real action orientation and been involved in some very fast growing companies, for example. And that is not the responsibility of the board member. The board member is really there to have a view of the organization, to provide what hopefully is a little bit of wisdom, having fallen in a few potholes ourselves,
right.
and to not go execute, but to leave that to the leadership team. So I think understanding the role of board members as a fiduciary, as a steward for the mission and the vision of the organization. Clearly, one of their roles is to hire and fire the leader of the organization, but really to have it done through them. So I think it takes some conscious effort, and it's important to be thoughtful about that role, because for people who are on the executive side, there's a more natural tendency to dive in and really try to make some things happen. So it's important not to do that, but on the other hand, to also be very well informed. It's not okay to not be informed, that board members have a responsibility to roll up our sleeves to really understand the purpose and really the business that the organization is in, whether it's a nonprofit or a classical business, because it is a responsibility. And whether they're shareholders or if it's a faith-based institution, you're doing this really on behalf of God to make sure that we are being stewards of the organizations that we're responsible for. So I take those responsibilities very, very seriously.
I like the way you've outlined it in terms of stewardship. So I think for many of us, so thinking about my prior role at J.P. Morgan, people can picture a giant bank making oodles of money and the people sitting up on the 50th floor in the boardroom overlooking Central Park and what that looks and feels like, probably forgetting that we're all working for shareholders or stakeholders and what that looks and feels like. And your stewardship model of we're here to give back in some ways, to help improve, to coach and develop it. When you switched from your first time sitting in that sort of paid board director's role, how did you feel you were able to implement that and make it real?
Well, that's what we're paid to do. So if it's a paid position or a not paid position, I think the model of boards is to take advantage of the collective wisdom of a larger group of people who have themselves dedicated to seeing the organization fulfill its charter and its potential. So when we're drawn into that role, I think it's a very natural and an integral part of what that responsibility is to be the steward of that and to be responsible. And particularly for nonprofit organizations, and I've had the privilege of being a board member for some large ones, as much as $100 million nonprofit organizations and that have been around a long time. And one of the ways that we would often describe that as a board member is that we're keepers of the flame. It's like the torch. It's like
someone's giving it to you and you're to give it to the next generation.
Yeah, and it's the heart of the organization. It's making sure that the organization remains true to its mission, and also that the organization is serving the needs of society and people that it was set up to serve, or that it needs to evolve to serve differently if things are changing. So that's a very important responsibility. I was on the board of a K through 12 education where our kids went to school, and chaired that board for a number of years. And we did studies of other schools that had lost their way. They were schools that had been around for more than 50 years. And what you find is that what normally happens, and the thing that is the largest contributor to them losing their way, is they will get into financial difficulty, for example. And then out of the financial exigencies, they will compromise the mission. And then over time, it drifts away and becomes very different than it was started to be. And it's really not fulfilling the purpose that it was set out for. And I don't mean to describe this as a calcified, rigid organization that can never change, but with that responsibility of being the keepers of the flame, being responsible for the vision and mission of the organization, that's a really important part of a board's work. And I think the best boards, particularly those that are nonprofit boards, spend a lot of time being centered on the mission of the organization, understanding it, wrestling through documents that describe it, going through governance procedures that ensure that decisions that are of the type that would change the direction of the organization, require supermajorities, for example, or things that cannot be done easily, because you can't take those things lightly. So the board is really in that very distinct role of having that responsibility, and then the executive or leadership team is really responsible for executing it. So I think bearing that in mind is what makes it interesting, but also adds the weight of responsibility to being board members for those kinds of institutions. boards.
And I'm sure most of us can envision that sort of passion and stewardship for the nonprofits. I remember at JP Morgan, we talked all the time. We have hundreds of years of heritage. We have been serving clients in countries across the world. We continue to do that because the people now are preparing it for the next generation. So I imagine that same mindset applies no matter what board role seat you're in.
Yes, it does. And even for businesses, I have, as we talked about briefly, this deep conviction about the role of business in contributing to a better society. And when you view it through that end, the work that a business does is noble. Whether it's putting internet on airplanes or providing voice over internet or providing cell phone services or bringing new telephony services to Brazil or trying to make high octane gasoline out of wood chips, all businesses that I've been a part of helping to build, to me, as viewed through that lens, that's really important and noble work. So I do think it's important to view it that same way. It may not on the surface have the same apparent eternal perspective for that, but I think viewed through the right lens, it's very noble and it's a very important work to do right.
So I would love for our listeners to understand a bit more about your journey. So we talked age 26-year-old, you're in your first board. Can you walk us through the stories of when I'm going to make the split almost in the line here, when you went on your first nonprofit board role, what led you to that and how that happened, and perhaps also in the same paid board role as a non-executive?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And the short answer is almost all of the board positions that I have been a part of have come through a relationship of some kind. And I think people who are aspiring to be board members or even think about how our careers could progress focus, I think, too much on technique and not enough on contribution. And I think the best way to prepare for becoming a board member is to develop a basis of expertise and a set of relationships that can and will lead to opportunities like this. So just to give you a couple of concrete examples. So when I was in my late 20s, I was joined a startup company out of business school. I had 5 offers coming out of business school, and I took the lowest paying offer because it was all about...
that doesn't sound like Harvard Business School to me.
It was a different form of economics. Well, it was about the equity. It was about building value and creating something of significance, and that was the draw for me. And so we were in this company in Colorado. In fact, the company at the time was 1,000 square feet in a tin shed in the middle of an alfalfa field in Loveland, Colorado. And my wife looked at me and said, "Wow, we spent all this money and all this investment for this, right?" And but no, we were committed. But we also thought if we lost everything we had, it would be about $0.98, right? So it was a good time to take a risk. But out of that, the company grew fast and ended up being the 110th fastest growing company in the U.S. And so we built a new building. And out of that, I got to know some of the people in the community and the Chamber of Commerce. And then we were a contributor as an organization to the United Way. So then the United Way said, "Would you come in and be involved with us and help distribute the United Way for the funds? And would you be involved with the Chamber of Commerce? And then would you start a manufacturing council with a large business that was moving to town?" So they wanted to team up a small, rapidly growing entrepreneurial business with a large business. And so those relationships were what led to then an invitation to be on the development board for the city. And then I got to know the people who ran the largest banks in town. But it was really
almost sounds like a snowball effect here.
Yeah, it was really about that and making that contribution. And then when we moved to Seattle through a friend who was the leader of a large organization in Seattle, we got to know each other, and he said, "Oh, you should think about getting involved with what was Seattle Pacific University at the time." So I started by being on the executive advisory board for the business school and did that for a number of years, and then got asked by the president to be on that board and become a trustee. And then it turned out that the guy who was the dean of the business school for many years went to run a very large nonprofit organization in the U.S. and asked me to be on his board. So it really came out of those relationships. And you think, oh, does it sound like cronyism? And I suppose at one level, perhaps it is. But I think at another level, coming onto a board and recruiting new board members has a lot to do with trust. And it's important for the leaders of the organizations and the other board members to have a sense of the trust of both the competence and the character of the people who are being invited onto boards. So I think that's one of the reasons that relationships are a primary connection point and a gateway to people joining boards.
So I think a lot of us hear the word networking and we think, oh, that sounds like hard work. It sounds a little scary. I don't want to put myself out there and put my aspirations on someone else. But if I interpreted the networking that you did was almost as a secondary thought. You were doing a really good job. Doors automatically opened by people just having conversations and helping others, which led to various opportunities. They continue to grow. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think you have characterized that right, Alexander. I don't really like the word networking because it sounds manipulative. It sounds contrived.
Right.
It sounds self-oriented, and I think it can be all of those things. For me, it's about really doing a good job getting to know people along the way, developing relationships. So relationships are important to me. They're, I think, what makes life fun and makes life come alive in many ways. And we each have our own set of relationships as we go through life, professionally and personally. And I think to have the opportunity to have those kinds of relationships is really a gift. And as we do jobs well, and people see that, and we get to know people who run in these kinds of circles. And as we get older, I'm no longer 26. The circles that we're a part of that include more influence are kind of natural places to find introductions and for people to make introductions. But to me, I really hope it's not done out of a sense of manipulation or self-advancement. It's really about, as we become less and we think more about how to make the world a better place, that I think is what becomes more attractive to others and enables us, frankly, to do a better job as we are less about ourselves and more objective and more focused on the mission, the vision, the contribution of the organizations to the world.
I think that's well said. And I mean, if I give my own little story on it, I imagine as I was building my board career and asking people for their time, let's have a coffee. I'd love to learn about your experiences and lessons learned. I think people generally are happy to share about themselves. And you have a conversation, you see if there's a fit, maybe it leads to another conversation. So it doesn't have to be this intense, I need to steal from your pocket in order to advance myself.
Yeah, that's right. And people see success. I mean, one of the more successful business experiences I had was the opportunity to work at Nextel Partners. It was the fastest growing wireless company in the U.S. It went from break-even cash flow to $750 million in cash flow in 4 years, and we sold it for $10 billion. And I think I had 32 calls from mostly recruiters about, well, how about this job, how about that job? And my usual form of inadvertent lack of wisdom, I said, well, now's a good time to take a purposeful pause. So I actually took a pause at that time and didn't know if I would go back to work, but I was on 6 boards, nonprofit and for-profit boards, and was making that contribution. And then actually I did go back to work after about 3 years because I felt so deeply about the things we're talking about here, about the power of business to contribute to a better society, and then went and took another kind of high-octane job, as one of my friends calls it, in another organization. So, but the point is that what makes us attractive as prospective board members are experiences that demonstrate our competencies and our ability to do things well, and for better or for worse, success by the world standards, and not just financial success by any means. That's really not what I'm trying to center this around, but is a level of competency that leads to contribution.
And I'd love to just go back for a second. You were talking about suddenly you were this very important, popular person. People were calling you and considering opportunities. Headhunters is something that we talk about on occasion on this show. And in some ways, they can be the gateway to opportunities just because they know about them. They're filling board roles. We were talking about networking before as well. I think there's guidance that people have heard of. You should talk to headhunters and become someone who's on their radar. And it's almost like the old adage of how do you get a job that experience, how do you get experience without a job? Because the headhunters are looking for people who've done it before, plug and play somewhere else. Have you been in a public company board? Good, then you can have it. Well, how do I get that first one to be in that club. Any thoughts on how people connect into that sort of world?
Yeah, headhunters play an important role in this regard. And I have been recruited by headhunters and have relationships with them, get calls from them, as many of us do. And the boards I've been a part of too, we've used headhunters quite extensively, and some of the reason for that is that they're very well connected. They keep amazing what we used to call Rolodexes, but I suppose now it's more like
that's
LinkedIn.
just on my phone, right?
Yeah, that's right. But they have these great sets of relationships and have them very well organized. I'm always amazed if I get a call and how much they know about me and what I've been up to. It's a little bit of Big Brother, but they play an important role, and they're used to there's a discipline of finding board members. I mean, the best boards will do a matrix of the skills that they're looking for, where we have those skills met, where we have holes in that matrix, what are the kinds of skills that we need to fill. And once they do a thoughtful job of that, to be able to go to a recruiter and say, here's what we're looking for. And in my lives, as we've used headhunters to do board recruiting, we will usually interview the headhunters and we'll do a screening process. We'll tell them what we're looking for. We'll run a beauty contest, as it's often called, for them, and as a result of that, select one based on their ability to find the right kinds of board members, because it's very important to do that well, and not only for the specific set of skills that the board is looking to fill, but for the mosaic of the full board, and also the chemistry on the board. That's an important part of boards. I mean, we're humans, and there's always a board dynamic, and you want that to be as constructive as possible, and where it holds the leadership of the organization accountable, but is also constructive and is thoughtful and has the relevant experience that they can bring to bear.
And I've seen quite a wide range of the experiences with headhunters going through that process. Some where you have the psychometric tests that you're taking on some level, to others it's just about conversations and fit. Sometimes you get brought before the whole board for a final round interview. Sometimes you just meet with some people individually. What are your thoughts on helping someone understand what it would be like to go through that process?
Well, most boards will have what is called a nominating committee or a governance committee, and the primary charter of that committee is to identify the skills needed on the board and prospective candidates. So that usually starts with that, and it'll start with an in-depth interview, first with the headhunters if they're using a recruiter, and then with the head of the nominating or governance committee, and with those members. Often boards will have a lead director as well, so it will involve an interview with the lead director. And these are, at least in my experience, less often paper tests and psychometrics, and much more about sitting down together and talking about our philosophies, how we see the business going, really strategic conversations. Want to make sure that there's strategic alignment around where the business could go, or where the organization can go. Also a deep values fit, particularly if it's a nonprofit organization if it's a faith-based heritage or other things that are important to it. So make sure that there's real alignment on a board with the board and the organization. So, and then the chemistry. So when I interview people, I use the 3 C's, and I think that's been used on me as well, or as I've used board members: competency, character, and chemistry. And so I think fitting all 3 of those criteria is probably, at the end of the day, what gets measured in some version.
It's a very simple model. We're both business school guys, right? We can apply that, the 3 C's. I like that. In terms of your goals for yourself for the future, right? So we've talked about how you're not 26 anymore, but you're involved in lots of things. You got lots of goals. Where do you envision your board career going as you continue to move forward?
Well, at the moment, I am fully engaged in helping run a public company that we're in the midst of doing a turnaround on.
So no more headhunters should call you right now, is what you're saying.
So I'm more than 100% occupied. But no, I do appreciate the opportunity to be on boards, and I have limited to that before I took this job, and I was actually approaching this company to be on their board and not to join the executive team. And then the more they asked me if I would consider that, and the more I learned about it, the more interesting I thought that would be. So that's what lured me in. But prior to doing that, my wife and I were on 6 boards between the two of us, and some mostly nonprofit boards, ranging from $100 million nonprofit that's involved with campus work to an orphanage in Honduras, and a college. So you can't do that and be part of helping to run a large scale public company. So I've really tried to scale that back. But at some point, I suspect that will be a part of my portfolio for the next season. My dad's 95, and my parents are both veterinarians, gratefully both still alive, and my dad still works part time. So my view of retirement,
passion for his job.
Well, my view of retirement is probably not the typical cultural definition. Somehow, my golf game is bad enough that it would be too high stress if I did that for the balance of my life.
That's great. I would love it if it's okay with you just to unpack that a little bit more of the current company you're with now. You were actually approaching them about being on their board. Can you give us a story about what that was like? How did you go about it?
Sure. I was winding up the last business opportunity I'd had and had recruited a successor, and it was a natural place to do that, and was starting to look for a board to get on. And again, the introduction was made through a connection that I've had. This one actually went back to my days in business school, somewhere just after the Paleozoic era, so quite a long time ago. And anyway, he made the connection and said, I think you should get to know the CEO of this company, and because he knew I was looking for a board position, but the company said, well, we don't really have a board position for someone with your background, but we do have a role here that we think you might be interested in as the chief financial officer in that case. So that's what happened.
I think that's a great example of the networking and how that works. So it's people that you know and care about, and vice versa, thinking, how do we just pay it forward for each other in some ways?
But just to give you an example of I guess if you want to use the word networking, when my wife and I took this purposeful pause, as we called it, or she would say it was more for me than for her. She was still just as busy as she ever was. But it ended up being 3.5 years. And after about 2 years, we looked at each other one night over dinner. I remember it distinctively, as we were going to visit our son in college. And we both said, I think I should go back to work for the reasons we're talking about, because I really wanted to make a contribution. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm in no hurry to do this. I talked to 115 people in that process.
Wow.
And I made a list of 30 people or so and say, who should I talk to? And they introduced me to other people. And it was a wonderful, rich experience. And in fact, we're having this interview on the campus of Gordon College. And through that process was how I met Michael Lindsay, who is now the president of Gordon College. And we struck up a friendship, and then he ended up interviewing me for one of his books, and then invited me to get closer to the college as part of a council of 125 that helped provide input to the strategic planning process. And now I'm on the board here. So that's another example. But those 115 people I met with, I found to be just a wonderful, rich experience, and it really helped me clarify what I wanted to do and where my giftedness was and where I wanted to plug in, and it turned out to result in some lifelong friendships.
I think that's also great nuggets for all of us to take away, investing time up front to figure out where your time and your treasures are best spent and how they can go forward, because clearly you found ones that you're passionate about, which is why they're a great fit. Is that fair?
Yeah, I am passionate about the things that I do, but I think the other thing I've learned is that it was really based on the mistake I made in my early career, which was I was trying to derive meaning from my work instead of bringing meaning to the work. And as I really reflected on that more through some 350 pages to myself, written mostly in the middle of the night, I realized that the onus is on us to bring meaning to the work. And when you think about it that way, it's the perspective of the work that we have that makes it come alive. And it has animated my work life these 25 years. It really has. It's why I have so much energy to do what I do, and whether it's being part of a leadership team of an organization or being a board member, that I really just see the power of organizations to contribute to a better society and our responsibility to help them do that.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap this up today, thinking about how everyone can tap into that for themselves and realize, I would almost call it like the give and take model that Adam Grant talks about. It's about sharing that, what you have with others and what flows from that. And I think you've given a lot to us today, and I'm grateful for you for coming on the Boardroom Bound podcast. Barry, thank you so much for giving us your time and your talents.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much, Alexander, and thanks to all of you for listening today.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Barry Rowan. I was amazed about how he was honest about the way he thinks about work, how he loves to share the fact that he is about bringing meaning to his work, not about finding meaning in his work. He talked through that struggle and how that had advanced in his career and what it meant for him. He's got a transformed view of business, that it's about transforming society, and he wants board roles and companies he's working with and nonprofit organizations where he can make a difference and give it back. And through all of that, he also talked about how he has gone through that experience of interviewing and shared what that was like. Lots of takeaways for all of us. A reminder to all of you that you can head over to podcast.gordon.edu, where you can not only subscribe, but get links to all the resources and see the best ways to connect. And finally today, if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd encourage you just to take 30 seconds to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews on iTunes are one of the best ways to get word out about this show. So thanks for joining me on the episode of the show today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.